today's theme, because the conference itself is organized in 4 major themes, and today's is rebuilding our economy, rebuilding our imagination. And for me, it's just so important as a reminder that no matter what it is that we are building or doing, we can't solve things with technology. It's also a matter of, or not with technology only, but no matter what we do, it's also a matter of rebuilding our mindset and the way we look at things. So the person that is going to join us next is Ruth Catlow. She's co-founder of Furtherfield in London, and she has founded many, many interesting artistic and decentralized initiatives. And Ruth certainly is an inspiration and a person that has very often reminded me of how rebuilding and reorganizing our imagination can actually work. So Ruth, hello, you're already here.
Hello.
Hello.
Amazing to be here.
Very happy to have you here. Where are you? This looks very organic, Ruth.
I'm actually in Southend-on-Sea, which is 40 miles due east of London on the North Thames estuary. I'm not actually in a muddy pool, but like in lockdown, a lot of time is spent at screens, and I do like to get out into the wilds a little bit. So I thought I'd bring a bit of it back with me today.
Wonderful. Yeah, so Ruth and I, we have been meaning to have this conversation since quite some time, right? But then we didn't manage to get together, or there was not a real good framing for it. But then we thought, okay, for this Money Lab, we definitely sit down and have a proper conversation on all things decentralized. So the name of this session already is quite interesting. It's DECAL and DISCO, and it's DIWO and DAO and whatnot. So there's this big D in front of
decentralize all the things.
Exactly, decentralizing all the things. And we know that this can't be the answer, right? But because decentralization in itself is not a value or not any instrument to solve any problem. But nonetheless, I wanted to ask you, Ruth, because I have been observing or witnessing and taking part in your work since years. And you were certainly one of the first people who discovered the blockchain sphere for artistic production. And I'm just really interested in this moment where you understood for yourself that there is an interesting combination, and how did it all start? Maybe you can take us back to that moment.
Yes. So I guess it came out of conversations with people in the Furtherfield network. So artists, developers, and activists and thinkers who had long been experimenting with networked media as a kind of as something that was simultaneously a social medium and a medium for expression, distribution, and activation. And I think my first real kind of conversations around the blockchain were with Rob Myers, now Ria Myers, fantastically. So Ria Myers basically started talking to us about the blockchain as a kind of artistic medium. And we started to understand that by working with the blockchain in the same way that we had with the internet, we could start to interrogate the relationship between money, art history, art, value. So while the web was this internet of communications and messaging that had at first produced this kind of flowering of collaboration across kind of like grassroots grounded flowering, but across different geographies, the blockchain reintroduced the idea of economy, assets, and scarcity back into this mix. And there were a whole load of things that happened, but I think the thing that really solidified it was a paper that Ria Myers wrote called DIWO, which took a kind of term that we'd been playing with at Furtherfield since the mid-noughties called DIWO. So this was DIY, but do it with others rather than do it yourself. So this idea of a kind of punk, make your own tools, make your own platform, but rather than it all being about the genius individual, it was about the genius of the collaborative, the collective in network media. And Ria's piece was kind of like a prompt and a challenge for us to think about how we could work with these new automated organization tools called decentralized autonomous organizations that sat on the blockchain, and to think about how we might apply this kind of playful, critical DIWO aesthetic in a medium that also did assets and kind of exchange tracking. And from that, I guess there were kind of the work that was already, I mean, development and business, tech development and business were already coming together very strongly to look at the potential for kind of speculative opportunities, along with a whole load of other things very much to do with finance and hyper-financialization. But the thing that really gripped us was this idea that we now had a technical infrastructure that would enable us to think about how we could manage things jointly, because it not only enabled us to think about asset exchange, but also voting and governance. So we'd launched a program called Art, Data, Money in 2015, which was we put out a bold call, which was saying that we wanted to create a commons for art in the networked age, working with blockchains and big data. And I guess the core things in here are cultures made by communities that create their own resources and then manage their own resources. And we just dug into this and worked with a ton of really smart people in this very hard to grasp territory, often made harder to grasp because the cultures that moved in first and fastest were unlike the cultures I was certainly used to, so often from finance or from tech or from kind of VC cultures. And we made a film called The Blockchain Change Everything Forever, which was intended to act as a bridge by kind of tapping into the excitement that was out there in startup and business culture and strike fear into the hearts of everyone else in order to get us into a space and know that there was a conversation to be had. And we co-edited a book called Artists Rethinking the Blockchain that actually really kind of pulled together a lot of really early work in the space, both theorization, practice, and speculative fiction. And we produced a couple of exhibitions that then also toured. So it was kind of like working with across art and theory and speculation to understand what the possibilities of this stuff were and to pull people from across very different sectors and backgrounds to have conversations and start to try and find both common vocabularies, but also to find the edges of what was tolerable to all of us, and to understand where resistance should be made, and just to try and understand and feel it better, feel what it was going to do and where we should get in the middle of it.
Yeah, Ruth, I think it's safe to say that you have been really working through all the extremely hard stuff, right? And I guess that a lot of pioneering work has been done here, because the technology itself and let's say the protocols, etc., are already complex in themselves. But then once you master that, you realize that there is far more complexity behind the technology. And this is something I realized in many of the projects that I contributed to, that once you have a certain idea of platforms you're going to use and protocols and technologies, there's this huge question of how to do things together, right? How to communicate to each other, how to be inclusive, how to manage to have an idea of, how to capture people's sentiment, first of all, I think is super important. How to make people accountable for their work, how to make sure that everyone is working towards a certain goal. Everything we formulate under the term decentralized governance, which in itself is already super complex. But then it's also the question of, how to if you manage to make money out of such a project, then how to divide it, how to make everyone participate here. So I realized that in all these projects, entering them, it was like entering a world of enormous complexity. And for me, it's the question I have to you: what are maybe your major learnings in this field of decentralized governance? What do you find particularly complex? And did you maybe also manage to overcome some of these complexities, maybe just by, experimentation, or can also be common sense? I mean, there are many ways of mastering that. But yeah, I would be interested in hearing a little bit from you how you approach that, and whether you managed to master a little bit of that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, I think if you're coming from the artistic position, there is always a bit of a confidence problem with the tech, that you think that the thing that is keeping you out is your lack of technical understanding. And I think one of the things I've really learned over the years is that maybe the barrier to engaging with this stuff is it's less the tech actually than the complexity actually lies in the difficulty of doing governance in any way at all, the difficulties of organizing, coordinating, finding some way to come to common agreement, to build allyship, or to negotiate for mutual interest, and to understand when that is and isn't possible. So I think to some degree, I think that one of the things that I've been really, especially actually more recently, as we've done some work to really get our hands on some DAO platforms, we've kind of discovered that the tech is like really not as sophisticated as we hoped it might be. It can't do some of the things that we do really simply when we're trying to work something out, when we're trying to organize, when we're trying to decide something, when we're trying to distribute things. And that in the tests we've done, we've ended up using DAOs more to kind of ratify the things that we've had to decide offline, because once we try to formalize a kind of decision-making process, you just realize how complex these things are. So to start to think about automating all of that, really, and this is why we're going to meet the disco guys later. Mm-hmm. And I think all the really strong, interesting projects are those that understand that culture has to come before structure, and that then you build the minimum structures you can to allow those cultures to thrive. And yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you did. And at the same time, I know there's so much stuff still we can talk about. Yeah, I have one moment in my head, just to add a little bit from my own history, and that was, when was it, 2.5 years ago, when a project I was involved in, Archain Europe, was we built a tech cooperative, but in our very very own terms, like a real cooperative. So it was this whole idea of taking decisions together, and democratic control, collective ownership, and all of that. So I think we did a pretty good job, and also there was some funding for us from the initiators in the US. But then we received the funds in token, and the token plunged. And it was just in the midst of a huge crash. And yeah, in the end, there was simply not much left. And then, this was for me a really interesting moment, because I realized in that moment, it was not just the money that went away, or the value, let's say, but it was like the whole confidence in the project that went away. It was as if, the life spirit of everything we have been working on went away overnight. And I found that really interesting. And that also, that sort of underlines what you said about the culture, because if there is no culture there to sort of buffer that, like financial loss, or because it can happen very easily. If we work in this realm, it can happen easily that a token does not operate as successfully as we have hoped for. But at least if there is a little bit more to that, systems of care and, value systems that are not entirely based on money, then at least there is a chance that something remains in the end. And, I'm just really interested if you ever had experienced also such a loss, like a real physical loss in terms of funds. Did you experience that so far? And could you cope with that?
I guess, I remember the Archain value collapse. And what's so interesting is that confidence collapse did actually, in my kind of, I can't prove it, but it mapped onto my kind of like my perception of what the confidence was in a few very core people who, so it kind of mapped onto the behaviors of maybe a kind of guru figure. And this is really weird. So you have these kind of decentralized value systems that are mapping onto, that are so dependent on the believability of so few characters. I guess when we were setting up DECAL, so the Decentralized Arts Lab, we set out to set this up in 2018. Or 2017, I think we started working on it. And 2018, at the beginning of the summer, we had something that was starting to feel like promises from 3 different large companies who were doing their ICOs for the kind of money that would sustain 3 years' work, 3 very serious years' work, and allow us to work, like to pull together a group of people to do deep research. And across that summer, we had the ICO collapse, and all of that fell away. So that was kind of a lesson. And so I guess that was my experience. It was around the same time actually as the Archain event also.
Yeah, I mean, we already started to touch down on DAOs, on decentralized autonomous organizations, and you already made a comment earlier that you have a bit of a critical view on this what's the word? This automated,
Automation.
yeah, the automation of decision making on these platforms. But then I wonder, I mean, these are people, right, operating on those platforms, and they're just voting. They say yes or no. And in doing so, they've managed to vote up certain projects, or other projects get voted down, and therefore their likelihood of getting funded decreases. But in the end, is it really so automated, or is there anything wrong, let's say, in the culture of a DAO in the first place? I just try to wrap my head around how to improve that automation and decision making. Do you have any ideas about that?
I just think that in the experiments we've done, it became really clear that all the decision making and negotiation is happening back channel off chain. So, like, there's deals being made. People are expressing their kind of they're expressing their loyalties and rewarding people. They're using these kind of systems to do that. And actually what happens is a lot of these things are happening in the background. So with systems where it looks as though it's all very transparent, like all the decisions are made online, but it doesn't actually necessarily give you any insight into the reasons why, or like like where the power, it isn't a transparent map of power, basically.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I can relate to that, to the map of power, right? Also, maybe to build on that, isn't this whole discussion around voting, isn't that also pointing in the same direction, where we can now discuss whether yes or no voting, whether that is I mean, that's obviously one thing, but capturing member sentiment and understanding why people relate to certain things in a certain manner, it's also really important, right? Because only if you have an idea of what people actually like or dislike, you can start creating cultures or systems that are maybe anticipating future behavior, and that creates a little bit more, sustainability within the group. So I wonder what it is that we still have to learn around decision making, because very often it's still tied to the binary voting mode.
I mean, I feel like we've been thinking about this really a lot. This is an area that we've been at Furtherfield, we've been digging into, like, through different projects. And I think it's always, we think about this, we kind of test different things by thinking about who it is that we want to decide with. Let's put it like that. So the two very clear examples I can give, because I think it's helpful to think about things in a concrete way, are a project we're developing at the moment at Furtherfield called Culture Stake, which uses quadratic voting on the blockchain. And this is a tool that is designed to enable people in localities to select an artwork. So they experience a taster artwork or a number of taster artworks, and then they select the piece that they feel belongs most in their locality, the thing that they would like to commission at a larger scale. Mm-hmm. And we are using quadratic voting, which is a system that allows people to vote not only a yes or no, but with to also convey the intensity of their preference. So it allows them to weight their voting. And I'm starting to understand that this is sitting somewhere actually between something like a referendum and a survey. Mm-hmm. So it's not actually, and one of the things that there were kind of two things that inspired us to want to develop this piece. One was a sense of dissatisfaction about a situation in which in our gallery we kind of funnel work that we think is fantastic from a kind of international digital scene into a local gallery and then benevolently bestow it on the locality. That was starting to just feel wrong. So we knew that we wanted to work much more closely with the people who we were working amongst to have them contribute more to shaping our programs and our curation. And the use of quadratic voting is allowing us to both they're selecting works that they think are most interesting and then able to rank the things, tell us what is most meaningful about those things and why they like them the most. And the other thing was just the horrific experience of Brexit and this the kind of referendum that told us nothing, that was kind of decided on this fraction of a vote, that has left the UK in a situation where any wanker can basically interpret the vote in any way they want and say, oh yes, but the vote tells us this about the British people and what they want. And so one of the things that I think we need voting systems that put more data into a system and then allow people to hold that data as a commons to inform the things that they do going forward. And this is the thing that excites me about DAOs, is that we can start to imagine a situation where groups of people can act together, have a record of the way they have acted, and also to marshal their kind of assets for a kind of towards a kind of collective imaginative project, but where the record of the things they've done start to become a kind of co-owned heritage. And this feels useful and interesting and empowering, actually.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ruth. And I would really like to come back to the commons, because I know this has played a role in your work all over the past years. And one thing I find quite interesting is that I observe a tendency that a lot of people steer away from seeing the economy as, in these traditional silos, meaning there's the market and there's the producers and the buyers and all that, but there's more to it, right? And there's, just to give 2 examples what I mean when I say more. If we, for instance, here in Berlin, want to establish an alternative to Airbnb, if we acknowledge that temporary housing rentals is a thing, that people want to have that, but also to realize that it's not based on a single entrepreneurial decision of people to build that, but it needs more stakeholders to make it possible. So that is one of the first things I realized, that if it's about building alternatives, we have to look into multi-stakeholder models, something that it's not so often found in the classic economics. And secondly, and that's also what I understand when we talk about the commons, it's this huge realm of it's a nature protection, and it's the question of who gets to benefit from what we are doing in what ways. And that does not only include a specific group of stakeholders, but that's also, it's a more expanded view on the nature and the planet and all livelihood, and how to bring all of that together. So I'm really curious about your learnings and perspectives in tying the commons into this already complex field.
I think that the basic foundation for thinking through these technologies with a commons lens is the very simple understanding that we need to shape, that the people who technologies serve need to be shaping those technologies. So one of the things that I've discovered in my hands-on tests with DAOs is that if they have complexity and if they have complexity in them, and if they're technically if they're hard to manipulate or customize, then it puts the person with the most technical capacity, it gives them an inordinate amount of power. And so this is actually a reason why I have found it very frustrating over the years, that let's call ourselves the progressive left. Like, I found it very frustrating that the progressive left has really not come into this space to any degree at all, because this technology needs to be shaped by people with more diverse political and cultural needs, values, and kind of intellectual perspectives. Otherwise, we end up with something that is built on an enterprise model, serving very narrow, kind of narrow interests, and where the wealth is already. Mm-hmm. And so the kind of a commons approach to this says we need to get many more diverse people and interests into the formation of these technologies, if we don't want a complete disaster. And so a lot of there's been huge antagonism in space just recently around the kind of environmental controversies, which I found enormously frustrating, because I think that they're just going to reinforce the kind of this idea that this is not a space that we should be in, that it's kind of inherently problematic, inherently earth harming. And I just see a lot of really good people who would have a lot to contribute finding it like so off-putting. Mm. And I think it's actually a bit of a catastrophe. Mm.
Yeah, I think it's true that we see a lot of white male Western liberalism in that field, and that diversity is lacking. However, I also see a rise of organizations and groups that already try to tackle that, right, and to come up with very progressive thoughts and also approaches to counter that. And we'll see some of them over the course of this.
I know you've got them in your program. This is the other quite frustrating thing, is that I think that there's some is that the recent controversies have just completely effaced actually some really inspiring and radical work that's been going on in this field for a really long time, from some really quite diverse, like people who are not from the usual suspects. And I think it's been really tough on people who are doing hard, conscientious, diligent work to address all of the not only environmental but social equality, social justice issues.
Yeah, Ruth, I don't know whether probably you are not following the chat right now, but I'm just looking into some of the prompts people are sharing here in the chat, and maybe if it's okay for you, maybe I can share a little bit of what is what it's asked, or what people think here. Would be really nice to maybe get a statement from you. So there is somebody writing that or observing that the real decisions were often made off-system or off-chain. I think that's because we are irrational creatures that grant authority to others based on intangibles, such as how much you seem to trust someone, based on irrelevant factors like charisma or friendliness. The problem is that we have done it that way since literally forever. So this is a question around leadership and around who is granted the right to speak or to lead. And very often these are very charismatic people, and it's also often dominant people. And so people argue about that there is a flaw in the very design of how decision-making system or how the economy itself is organized, right? And I think it's a really good question to ask, why was it designed that way? You know, probably you don't know the answer, but maybe you just
I mean, I have opinions, as you know. We have 7,000 plus years of patriarchy, which has organized the world in a certain way. And I think, like, organizing in a decentralized, distributed way is going to be really messy. And we have, like, in in 70s feminism, we have The Tyranny of Structurelessness, this fantastic essay that was kind of like showing us what a nightmare it was to kind of like, when you take away the kind of actually very efficient and sometimes very useful hierarchical structures of organization, about how easy it is for things to really get out of hand and go very badly wrong. And especially this thing of the kind of charismatic leader suddenly having terrible amounts of power. But like, I think as we have seen, especially in the last 5 years, what's happened with network communication, like, this is here and we have to find a way to deal with it. Like, we need to build these new muscles. We need to build new ways to, like, new social muscles, new emotional, communal muscles for operating in this new globally networked world where we see ourselves together, where we can speak into these spaces, and where now we're amplifying and accelerating all of this with AI as well. I mean, It's here, and we've got to find a way to get into the middle of it and make it work for ourselves.
I wonder, for people who would like to dive a little bit deeper into that field, are there any useful resources or digital groups or Telegram channels or anything you found particularly useful, or that also enabled you to learn and to progress in that field?
I don't have one. I belong to about 10 Telegram channels, probably more, and at least 7 or 8 Discord groups. I mean, I just think people need to go wide and yeah, like try and go for diversity. I mean, we just did this program with the Goethe Institute that I co-curated with Penny Rafferty, which was a series of Art World DAO prototype building. One of them came out of the brilliant trust, who I know you are in partnership with, for Money Lab. And this again is an attempt to work across 5 different countries with 10 different partners. And I think it's really only by trying to, like, working out what's important to you and the people who you want to work things out with and want to work with, that you learn about this stuff. I don't think you learn it by reading things. You learn it by getting in the middle of debates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing I would really like to ask you, Ruth, is maybe coming back a little bit to artistic production and the blockchain, and this hope of groups being able to finance their work independently from the state or, from fans, whatever. So I think there has been quite a bit of stubbornness also in the past years, that it's actually not that easy to create anything completely independent from other groups of stakeholders. And also, I had a little bit the feeling that the hope of being able to create autonomous financial means without having to rely on anyone else does not really work. It doesn't work on the blockchain. It doesn't work elsewhere. And I think a precursor of that was a demand, at least it was widely discussed here in Germany, where people were asked that when they were given a certain percentage of state funding, that they should also match that funding with crowdfunding, for instance, to prove that there is real interest in what they do, right? So what I observed over the past years is that this, this question of how arts and culture should be funded, whether it's ethical to say, oh, they should do it for themselves and they are completely independent, or whether this is a task of the state or of the citizens. And there's a lot of talk about that and a lot of opinions on that. And I'm really curious, how do you see that? Also, with your perspective, living in London, with Brexit and all that, how do you see that, Ruth?
It's messy. It's just really messy. So for transparency's sake, Furtherfield has received Arts Council funding. So this is public funding since 2004. The contract we have with the Arts Council requires us to match that. So that's either in partnership with other organisations commissioning us or through private donation, and it has been very precarious at times, and not just like there is no easy answer to this, because especially in the kind of phases of early crowdfunding, like when this was supposed to be the answer to everything, the kinds of exploratory edge work that it's the thing that we do, does not lend itself to marketing, and crowdfunding depends on having a marketable something to describe to a target market. So that's really problematic. I mean, I think whatever methods we've always worked in a kind of nested way. So we will work with the funding that we have and then put that funding in the middle of something else, and kind of patch together the economies for the things that we feel kind of driven to make, that we think are important. And I think this idea of autonomy is a fantasy, and actually sometimes quite a dangerous fantasy, because there is no neutral. All money is coming with some kind of weight attached to it, or there's always it's coming with a heft of some sort, and wherever that funding's coming from is going to it's going to mean something, whatever you do. And it's going to mean something both to whoever then encounters the work that you do, or it already means something about what is expected from it. And I think we just need to, I mean, there are all kinds of tactical moves that one can make in relation to that. And that then becomes part of the rhetoric of the work, I think. But I think that's actually the fact that we've had to be a kind of had to play this balance between strategic and tactical all the time in all of our work is maybe one of the reasons why blockchain as a medium has been so fascinating to us, because it's kind of that it makes that much more explicit, that when you're working with a medium where value is baked in, where economic value is baked in, then you're having to be a little bit more precise about that.
Yeah, and then money acquisition becomes part of the creative process as well, right? Which can be interesting, but it can also be a real trap. So I'm curious for tomorrow, because we have I think the biggest chunk of the program is actually dedicated to new economies for arts and culture. And we'll hear tomorrow from different initiatives. We also have a I think, a really nice, even I would call it even experiment with Yael Sherrill, who is going to talk to the program director of a performing arts initiative in Berlin that is huge and that is willing to also to think of ways how to reorganize itself in a public event. I think that's extremely interesting, and I'm really looking forward to that. And that also,
I mean, yeah, and another one of my favorite projects around this is the Sphere. So this is, you'll know the Sphere, yeah. So this is circus and finance.
Yeah,
I think this is really great. These kind of collisions of finance with things that are expressive in all the ways, because like when we were talking about how hard it is for people to engage with governance, I think it's the same with both money and finance. I think the level of literacy, certainly I found this in myself, my own literacy around what money and finance are, was like so weak. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a real problem how weak literacy is in this area. Yeah. And the more we can collide it with different expressive forms and find different ways to apprehend how it is actually moving in our societies and in our material worlds, the better.
Absolutely, yeah. This is something where we don't know. We are not really taught about that. It's expected from everybody to be an expert in finance in the sense of taking care of your own money, right, and creating your livelihood. If you are not good in doing that, then people look down on you and they think you're a loser. But actually, the literacy, how you say, the financial literacy, I would say, is nothing that people learn good enough neither in school nor in university. I guess it's pretty much the same as communication. So if we look at human beings and what they rely so much on money, they rely so much on communication, but they really suck in both arenas because simply there isn't enough literacy around it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably not an accident, because if everyone really knew how finance worked, then it might start spreading and flowing in a different way, like we've seen with GameStop, like we're seeing currently. Finance can only work in the way it works if most people don't really understand what it's doing.
Yeah. So, I guess so. And I remember the rage a lot of people felt when the economic crisis in 2008, when newspapers wrote that, look, it's too complicated to explain how all of that worked and what led to that crisis. So there was a narrative that was transported in quite some media outlets, where people were given the feeling that they are just not knowledgeable enough to put their hands on what has happened. And I think that was quite telling. Yeah, and since you just mentioned before about the 1970s feminism, I have a book here in this shelf behind me, and it's from Marilyn Waring, If Women Counted. It's a classic from the 1970s, and I think she was among the first who dared to speak up in public. I think she was a professor in economics. And then she claimed that it's actually impossible to talk about economics without taking into account invisible labor and care work. They don't even have there is no metric to sort of track the value of a good conversation, or if you look at someone in trouble, or taking care of people in your family, whoever. And I think she was among the first to really talk frankly about it, and to also demand that in this whole body of economic research, that this should be included, and that people should come up with completely different metrics of measuring these modes of work and value. And what is really interesting these days, and that's maybe it could be a positive outcome of the COVID-19 crisis, that people start discussing that. Because those people that are working on the front lines and really putting their lives at risk, these are considered as, what's this the English term? They are like essential. Yeah, these are essential workers, right? But they are not paid in an essential manner. So I think that's also, it's interesting to see how finally people start debating the value of that kind of work. To what extent does that play a role in your own research and in your own work, the invisible work?
I mean, yeah, so to keep, I absolutely love the work that Marilyn Waring did. Like, she did this really kind of careful tabulation of the labor of women, and to look at the work that was going unaccounted for and uncounted in kind of like international measures of GDP and all this kind of stuff. And it was really powerful, and they're very straightforward and very simple, and it really wasn't too complicated for people to understand. But so I guess the way we've been kind of making sure that we hang on to this is that we've been working with we've been working on a number of projects alongside this kind of more technical work or more votey style work. So we've been working with Cassie Thornton and the Hologram, which is a peer-to-peer feminist healthcare system. We running these live action role plays, which give us a way to ensure that we're constantly working with a kind of the social reality that exists between us, to ensure that we are really attending to what is important to us as humans, so that we don't get lost in these kind of crystalline structures or theories of how things ought to be if they were clean. And of course, the disco guys have been very inspiring to us. I mean, I say these disco guys, I am one of the disco guys, but the work that's being done through discos is this kind of careful work to ensure that care is accounted for, but that there isn't a rush to put everything onto the blockchain. You know, there isn't that it's kind of holding back, going slow. I think if I've learned anything over the last 5 or 6 years, it's to be really circumspect about the things that we put into a mechanism. Like to kind of like try and think about what we can keep off the mechanism, and what we can keep amongst human systems will be a way to maybe reduce some harm, and to do that work really slowly.
Yeah. And Ruth, we are, I could move on forever having this conversation, but we are moving towards the end of our talk. I just wanted to invite you to maybe share some future visions and projects you are currently working on. What is it that comes next for you, or what is it what you would love to do?
Well, so this summer at Furtherfield, we run this gallery, a small gallery in the heart of a park in North London. The people who use this park, it's used by people who speak 200 different languages. It's a very diverse part of London. And of course, the park has become a real, it's a very high value to people during lockdown. And it's a place where people really hang out and can get a bit of a break from the stresses of pandemic life. And this summer, we are using this culture stake quadratic voting project that we have to present and invite people to experience 3 works that are made specifically for the locality, as digital works, and then they will vote in the locality, but also internationally. But the international vote is worth less than the local vote. So we've weighted it so that the local voters have more say. And then we will produce whichever work is selected as most belonging in that area. So this is one thing that we're working on. We're working on 2 LARPs at the moment. I have the pleasure of collaborating with Cassie Thornton on a LARP for the hologram, which is really thinking about what a kind of collective feminist peer-to-peer healthcare system looks like in 2050. So we are all wearing our best selves into the future to think about what that looks like. And I'm working with Cade DM at the New Design Congress on another live action role play for multi-species justice in the park. And we're developing this year, and it'll roll out across the winter and become something that the users of the park can play to make a treaty for multi-species justice in the park.
Fantastic. That sounds really good, Ruth, and I'm sure it's going to turn out really great.